Well, the end first, because it was a very dramatic finish to the US Grand Prix. A victory finally for Max Verstappen on the day in which we remembered the incredible contribution to Formula One and obviously to the Red Bull team by Dietrich Mateschitz, who's just passed away. A very emotional win for all at Red Bull, particularly for Max, particularly for Christian Horner and of course Helmut Marko as well. So congratulations to all of them. Today, they also clinched the Constructors' Championship with a P1 and a P4 for Sergio Perez. But it was not easy by any means. Max's second pit stop, and he kind of had the race sewn up by then, was delayed by 9 seconds. It was an 11 seconds pit stop, normal stop time, 2.2, 2.3. Left front wheel gun appeared not to work. Really good work by the left front mechanic, I thought, of just having 2 goes with that and then calmly putting in the spare gun and getting him out there. And Max a little bit aggressive on the radio, I thought, on that lap afterwards. Of course he was upset, but he is a double world champion and he has secured the championship this year and the race was ahead of him. Instead of saying, don't worry guys, we can do this, it was thanks guys, thanks, expletive deleted, very much sort of thing. He quickly got out of that, but one of his engineers did have to get onto the radio and say, Max, we're all in this together, let's go for it. And he did a Max Verstappen job, absolutely superb. But this meant that he was effectively now chasing down Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton. Lewis Hamilton had undercut both Ferrari driver Leclerc and Max had had that delay, of course. Brilliant strategy by Mercedes. What's all that talk about Mercedes have terrible strategy? Really, really good call by Mercedes. And Lewis right on the edge all day, as we said yesterday in the Mercedes, to get that compromise right, as good as they could get it for this circuit. It meant that the car was right on the edge, dancing on the edge on those very quick corners. And Lewis just superb to watch throughout the afternoon. And a big problem for Max Verstappen as the back end of the race loomed. But let's talk first about his battle with Charles Leclerc, because to get to Lewis, Max had to pass Charles Leclerc. But Charles' weekend so far had been pretty fragmented. He'd recovered incredibly well on occasions, but it was not an easy time for him. Robert Schwartzman in his car for the first session recovered really well in FP2. FP3, he was there or thereabouts, but he got beaten in qualifying by his teammate Carlos Sainz and was also handed a penalty for internal combustion engine and turbo change. So he started P12, and on the opening corner, as a result of a shunt between Carlos Sainz and George Russell, initiated by George Russell running wide into the hairpin, losing grip, and at this point, Carlos Sainz was coming back across, having been passed by Max Verstappen. Unsurprisingly, really, Max on the inside run, making a good start into turn 1. He just T-boned Carlos, and that was the end of Carlos Sainz's race. Spun him round, and Carlos was out with, well, damage to the side pod, I would guess, definitely other tyre damage as well. George saying, oh, he came right across, but he did get the penalty for that. A and B, I think it was very lucky that George actually hit Carlos at that point, because he could very easily have hit Lewis Hamilton, who did a really good job of just running wide and of reading what was about to happen, running wide and going off track to avoid it all and getting through. Because can you imagine what would have happened if he'd hit Lewis at that first corner? It just gives a sort of scenario of if Mercedes are truly back next year in the World Championship again, and even perhaps towards the end of this year with a car that is looking pretty good. Imagine the racing and how tough it's going to be between George Russell and Lewis Hamilton. Anyway, he didn't touch Lewis, so there wasn't any of that, but he did get a 5-second penalty for initiating that shunt with Carlos Sainz. So for Carlos Sainz, and talking, not staying massively chronological here, but a lot happened in this race in Aston. But for Carlos Sainz, a very disappointing day. He had the pole, made a bad start, which is unusual for Ferrari. Ferrari's usually very good off the line. They have been most of the year. He needed that on that uphill run into turn 1. But by the time they got even to the braking area, Max was ahead. He was on the inside. Game over for Carlos Sainz. All he could try and do was just loop down inside him, which was what he was in the process of doing when he was taken out by George. So that was that. And in avoidance of all of that and some other stuff that was going on, some lockups, Charles Leclerc had to brake really hard about mid-corner of turn 1, having picked up 2 or 3 places off the line and dropped almost to the back of the field. So the first part of Charles' race was making up all that ground. And he was not looking too bad. He got up to about fourth or fifth when there was a safety car, because Valtteri Bottas, who'd been looking pretty good in the Alpha and parlaying his excellent qualifying performance into a seemingly good race performance, just lost the back end at the second last corner on the Alpha. He'd just gone to hard tyres and lost it. Not a particularly elegant move by Valtteri. He ended up in the gravel trap, as a result of which, to move the car, they sent out the safety car, and then immediately Charles came in. So all of a sudden, at a restart now, behind the safety car, Charles was on a new set of hard tyres, and he was P4 behind Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, going really well in the Mercedes, and Sergio Perez. So that suddenly brought Charles into the game, brought Ferrari back into the game. So it was an open book, really, to see now exactly how the three cars compared. The Red Bull, the Mercedes and the Ferrari, all on hard tyres. Charles' tyres brand new, the others only 5 or 6 laps old. But before we get to any of the answers to those questions, there was another shunt at the restart, this time on the straight, the sort of shunt that I absolutely dread when they're at high speed, top speed indeed. And whenever there's a shunt on the straight, usually it's going to be a problem because of the speed, because of the fencing both sides. And on this occasion, Lance Stroll had been going very well in the Aston Martin. He qualified well and he kind of held position as well. Sebastian Vettel was up there near him too. Lance Stroll was about to be passed by Fernando Alonso, who had a top speed advantage in the Alpine, but much more importantly, he was in the tow. And he came up behind Stroll and pulled out to the left. And as he did so, Stroll moved to the left, and his left rear caught the right front of Fernando's Alpine. There was front wing damage at that point. Burst the left rear tyre of Stroll's Aston Martin, which then spun into the guardrail on the right, had quite a big shunt. And on the left, however, Fernando was just launched in the air. And for quite a while, that's all we saw of the Alpine, just the underside of the Alpine. And it was quite interesting watching the onboard. At that point, Fernando, racer that he is, was already turning the steering to the right just to make sure he got the car in some sort of position when it came into land. Incredible thinking by Fernando Alonso. He hit the guardrail hard on the left, punctured the left rear. And then, of course, that meant that the Alpine was in the state in which Fernando Alonso loves racing cars. It was half falling apart, nothing was right, missing bits of aero, and he then drove brilliantly, having got the car back to the pits, to finish, would you believe, in 7th place. One of the best drives ever by Fernando Alonso. This goes right back. I think there was a race at Monza one year when he was driving for Benetton, for Renault, and part of the front wing broke and something else broke, and he was quicker with the car like that than he was when it was absolutely right. So this was adrenaline. This was pure raw Fernando Alonso, just astonishing. Most drivers wouldn't even have restarted, I don't think, after that shunt, and yet he drove superbly well. Stroll was correctly given a penalty for that move to the left, but it just shows with these cars, which are now able to follow one another much more closely, how critical it is that drivers on the straight, when they're in traffic and they've got cars behind them, don't move like that. We saw a move a bit later on in the race. Well, we'll get onto that in a second, between Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen. We'll get onto that in a second. So now there's another safety car, and they're going round and round and round. And this probably helps all the teams and drivers with their strategy, because now they're getting a little bit more mileage on all the tyres, and they can start to think about the end of the race. And there was also an element, of course, of the team here, because Red Bull, I guess, thinking Constructors' Championship, there's Sergio Perez ahead of Charles Leclerc in P3, Charles running 4. So the job for Sergio Perez, of course, is for as long as possible to hold up Charles Leclerc, because if you're Red Bull, you're Max Verstappen, you're thinking your biggest threat at this point is going to be Charles in the Ferrari. And Checo did a pretty good job of that for a couple of laps. There was a few moments at the end of the straight when they were side by side, but then in a nice DRS pass, Charles got Sergio and started to pull away. So now it was Charles closing on Lewis Hamilton, who was about 1.5 seconds behind Max Verstappen. And you thought, well, at this point, it's going to be the race between Charles Leclerc and Lewis, and Max is going to disappear. But it all changed on lap 35 of the 56-lap race, when Mercedes decided to bring Lewis in and break up the pattern and try to undercut both Max and Charles Leclerc. And it was a lovely 2.7 pit stop as well. So Lewis now rejoined on a new set of hard tyres. And the big call now for Red Bull and Ferrari in responding to what Lewis had just done, to what Mercedes had just done, was whether to put them back on the hard or to put them on the medium. And because the medium had a pretty good early phase of the race, both teams decided to put their drivers on the medium tyre. So now it was going to be Max on the medium, Lewis on the hard, Charles on the medium, all racing to the finish. The problem was Max had that delayed pit stop. It was an 11-second pit stop, and as I say, it was the left front wheel gun. So now he was rejoining in 3rd place, and Lewis Hamilton actually was having a bit of a dice with Sebastian Vettel, who was out of sync with pit stops, but driving very well in the Aston Martin, actually leading the US Grand Prix for a lap or two. But Lewis quickly got him, Sebastian came in, and that was Lewis leading the US Grand Prix and Max behind Charles Leclerc. And could Lewis Hamilton now win? I was doing a live stream on Twitch before the race, and one of the questions that came in was, do you think Mercedes and or Lewis or George can win a race before the end of the year? And I said, well, only if something weird happens, obviously, to Red Bull and Ferrari, and certainly today in Aston, something really weird has got to happen for a Lewis or a George to win. And of course, I suppose that weird thing was that 11-second pit stop, very unusual for Red Bull to have that sort of issue. But all of a sudden, here was Lewis Hamilton, absolutely superb in the Mercedes, on the ragged edge in terms of downforce versus straight line speed, the amount of downforce they was allowing themselves in the car. And that's probably why they went for the hard tyre, because they're going to be a little bit harder on the tyre because they weren't running as much downforce or generating as much downforce as Ferrari and Red Bull. But here was Lewis leading the Grand Prix and Max Verstappen now behind Charles Leclerc. And there was a possibility that if Max spent too long trying to get past Charles, or couldn't get past Charles, that Lewis Hamilton was indeed going to win in Aston. As it happened, I think the last phase of the race, although we'll talk a lot about Lewis's drive and dice with Max and how well Max drove to do the pass very quickly and just get away from Lewis towards the end of the race. I think the real point about the last phase of the race is how disappointing Charles and Ferrari were. They weren't able to hold Max off for very long, and then he wasn't, and Charles then was not able to do anything about Lewis Hamilton, which is, on a circuit like Aston, you've got to say that is a quantum leap forward for Mercedes, and they've done a really good job. It's probably also a function of Ferrari, with all their penalties, with all the dramas with the engine, with the power unit, and trying to get reliability, probably have run up against a bit of a brick wall in terms of development and taking steps forward, whereas Mercedes have done a really good job going into Aston with their upgrades, and the car around Aston was a Ferrari beater. That's amazing around a circuit like that with a straight as long as that. So let's just take a snapshot of what speeds they were doing and how the laps compared between the three drivers in that closing phase of the race. Lewis, breathless in the Mercedes, absolutely brilliant through sector 1. In sector 2, always struggling to keep within 0.3 of Max Verstappen as Max was starting to close on him. Top speed for the Mercedes averaged 293. Max Verstappen with no DRS 305. So think about that. That's 13 kilometers an hour quicker. So basically all Max had to do was match what Lewis was doing in sector 1 and sector 3 and just let the top speed of the Red Bull do the job in sector 2, which is what we talked about in the videos on Friday and Saturday. That was how Red Bull approached this race, and that's how they put the lap together, and that's how they put the race together. I made the point yesterday that the Red Bull appeared to have a more significant advantage in terms of top speed relative to Ferrari and therefore to others on a lighter fuel load, and so it proved. As the fuel load got lighter, so the margin with which Max could play, because of that top speed, became wider again. So he was able to look after his tyres, keep the car relatively straight, although there was quite a lot of banter towards the end of the race from both sides, from both Red Bull and Mercedes, about the number of times Max or Lewis were going over track limits. And by the end, both of them had 3 strikes, which meant that if it happened again, there was going to be some sort of penalty. And there was Lewis was saying, yeah, but he's done it again, turn 19, turn 6. And there was Red Bull saying, Lewis has just had his 3 strikes as well, Max, relax, sort of thing. And there was all this going on. It was quite, I think it's quite good how track limits have come into play and how tense the track limits issue made those last few laps of the race. But by lap 51, with 5 laps to go, and at this point, Max has just been slowly eating into Lewis's lead. Although on some laps, Lewis would go purple in sector 1, for example, and Max would be 0.2 slower. Then he'd regain that in sector 2. So it wasn't as if it was just an easy pass or an easy race for Max Verstappen. And he complained a lot too about the sensitivity of the Red Bull to crosswind. There was about a 5 to 6 mile an hour wind gusting in Aston, and the Red Bull, because it generates so much downforce from under the car, is probably more susceptible to crosswinds. All these cars are, compared with their 2021 counterparts, when there's a lot more downforce coming from the top of the car. And the Red Bull, because it generates so much, because it has therefore less, I guess, in terms of wing setting coming from the front and rear wings, is going to be more sensitive to crosswind. So that was another of Max's things. But he had to do this, had to make no mistakes. And eventually he caught Lewis to the point where he was kind of right behind him getting into the hairpin, and then Lewis just pulled away on acceleration as he would. And then Max started to regain it. And as they approached the braking area from quite a long way off, Max, you could tell that Max was going to have a move. And Lewis did, I think, a pretty good job. He jinked to the left, just as Max did a similar jink. And Max just stayed there, down the inside, and got him. And afterwards on the radio, there was a bit of talk about Lewis moving under braking. To me, that was a standard racing driver's move. It was no different from what we saw from several other drivers. It was different from what Lance Stroll did when he was flat out on the straight, when I guess he could feel or he could see in his peripheral that Fernando was pulling up, and he just did one of those. And bear in mind, this is the opening lap of a safety car release, so he wasn't exactly aware of how many other cars were around him as well, and there were a lot of other cars around him, to the point where Mick Schumacher backs off because there's just nothing but debris and dust in front of him, correctly backs off. And like a rocket on the left, Kevin Magnussen, his teammate, just goes straight past him. And on the other side, Esteban Ocon goes past him as well. Just a boom, like that. They gave their positions back, obviously. But for those two guys not to have slowed as Mick slowed, I find absolutely astonishing. And I think that needs to be looked into, because if the driver in front is reacting to a shunt and there's obvious stuff going on, what are those two guys going a million miles an hour either side of him? That was one thing. And then the other thing was how well I thought Pierre Gasly reacted to that. He had a terrible race, by the way, in terms of lots of other stuff going on. Penalty behind the safety car, penalty not served correctly, and then other stuff going on. But in the middle of all that, it was just like being back at Suzuka again for Pierre, because he was behind all this and he had nothing but smoke. It was just smoke, and he just had to go through it and beautifully moved the car in terms of reflex. Just did one of those and avoided everything, but it could have been a lot worse. It was a big shunt, that. Anyway, going back to the move by Lewis, to me, that's when you're doing it under braking. I know the rules probably say you can't do it or you can't change direction more than once or something, but to me that was okay. But the great thing when he did that was that Max just stayed there down the inside. But of course this is the left-hander at the end of the main straight, so then they go through like this, and Lewis has grip and he's way up on the left in front of Max as they're accelerating out of that left-hander, but Max is on the inside for the right and just says, okay, no problem, I'll turn in when I feel like it, Lewis, and does a really slow job there, just turns in at the last minute, and Lewis has no option but to go in behind him. And after that, it was kind of game over, although Lewis was still really quick and pushing him hard through sectors 1, or particularly through sector 1. So on that lap when Max actually had the DRS and did the pass, he didn't wait around, he just went for it, which is classic Max Verstappen. That's one of the things I really love about the way Max drives. When there's an opportunity to do it, he doesn't sit around and take a couple of laps to think about what he's going to do. It's just zonk, and he does the pass, and did that on Lewis. And he did that through the trap with DRS at 333 kilometers an hour. Lewis at that point was doing 295. I mean, it was just ridiculous. And then it was interesting to see what Lewis was going to do in the DRS behind Max, and his speed went up from 295 to 309, but still nowhere near where the Red Bull had been without the help of DRS. So that puts into proportion, I think, how much margin Red Bull had to play in terms of top speed. And that showed all year, but it particularly showed in the way they adapted and set the car up for this circuit as well. So where was Charles Leclerc in all of this? Charles got to within about 2 seconds of Lewis, and it looked to be pretty close. And he'd stayed pretty well with Max as well when he'd got past him. But then he had more tyre deg on the Ferrari, on the medium, than Max had on the medium, and certainly than Lewis was getting on the hard tyre. We've seen this on the Ferrari, since Singapore. Ever since they've been running medium tyres in the race, they seem to put more heat through them. It's a very, very difficult heat cycle on the Ferrari, it would appear. And he started to get deg with about 6 or 7 laps before the end of the race and started to fall away. So with his hard tyres still in reasonable shape, Lewis Hamilton was still able to finish second in the Mercedes, bring it home ahead of the tyre deg Ferrari on the medium tyre driven by Charles Leclerc, but admittedly driven from P12 on the grid. So in that sense, Ferrari should be reasonably happy with it. In the sense that they were beaten today by Mercedes, this is something new for Ferrari, and this will be a shock to them for sure. Sergio Perez finished 4th. George Russell came in right at the end for a set of soft tyres to set fastest lap, which he duly did. He was quickest purple in sectors 2 and 3, and purple in sector 1 was Lewis Hamilton. So Mercedes can go away from this race and say they were quickest in all 3 sectors around Aston. In a way, that's kind of a nice thing for them, because it was a really good job by the Mercedes team today. But as I say, looking back now, I think they were really lucky that George Russell didn't hit Lewis at that first corner. Lando Norris finished an excellent P6 for McLaren. Not a great circuit for the McLaren, but he got the absolute best from that car And Fernando Alonso brought the battered Alpine home in P7, ahead of Sebastian Vettel's Aston Martin, which was delayed massively in its second pit stop. So Fernando had the shunt, Vettel had the delayed pit stop, and it was Fernando that just beat Vettel to the line. But he passed Kevin Magnussen right at the end, who finished P9 for Haas. And 10th was Yuki Tsunoda in the AlphaTauri. He had a massive conversation on the radio about being on the medium tyre when his teammate Pierre Gasly was on the hard and shouldn't he be allowed to pass and what's going on, and he wasn't allowed to pass and anyway. That all ended up with Yuki finishing P10, Esteban Ocon 11th, and so on and so forth. So it was an excellent day at the races in Austin at the US Grand Prix. Lots of celebrities there, great weather, lots of fans as well, over 400,000 over the 3 days. Formula One is big and alive and well in the United States, and this race will not have done the sport any harm whatsoever. And Max's 13th win helped to clinch the Constructors' Championship for Red Bull, the first time they've won it since 2013, which tells you a lot about what Mercedes has been doing in recent past in Formula One, of course. I'll be doing another live stream looking back at this race on Monday, so I'm looking forward to having your questions and comments there, and I'll do my best to try and answer some of them. Sometimes I learn a lot more from you folk out there than I can from any of these stats here. And equally, congratulations to Red Bull on that double championship win now, the drivers and the constructors, on a day in which you remembered the massive contribution made to Formula One by Dietrich Mateschitz. Thanks for watching, stay safe, see you soon.